All right. Hey guys, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks for popping on. So this week I figured I would, because I've been getting some frequent slash common questions on some contracts, go over a couple of the lesser known contracts, and I'm kind of getting questions on. Don't worry, I'm not going to jump into the 1 to 4 family and just be tied up there for a whole hour. There are 4 or 5 separate addendums and amendments, and hopefully we'll keep it lively. But before I start, so next week at this time, I have actually lined up some CE credit for you through an inspection company that we deal with here in DFW called Super Inspector. So I'll send out the information after this call. And then 2 things. So I sent out an email earlier, I think yesterday, with a book that was a free download from an email I got from Texas Realtors. And so I said, okay, well, what the heck, let's download this thing. And it's an ebook of different scripts that might be helpful to you regarding interacting with various clients at various stages of the process. It was included in the email, but I also put it on our website under the business building tab. And there is not too very far down from the top, there's a heading called scripts for any occasion, I want to say. And there's 2 documents there. The most recent one is dated 2024, so that's the one. And then I guess the second thing is that inflation is down. I think that came out today. So there is usually a push towards the back end of the year, like right about this time until Christmas, regarding activity and buying and selling. So hopefully that will provide an added incentive for people to pull the trigger. So awesome. So with that said, let me share my screen. And the first one I want to go over is really what I think in generic terms we as realtors call the contingency addendum, but you'll notice the word contingency is not anywhere in this title. It's actually called Addendum for Sale of Other Property by Buyer. And if anybody has any questions on how to fill these out above and beyond what I'm covering, please unmute and ask your question. Be as interactive as you want. So the contingency addendum, or this document, which is, by the way, TXR 1908 or TREC Form 10-6, is specifically designed where a buyer has to sell another property in order to purchase the one that they're about to put a contract in on. And so unless they sell that other property, the deal's off. So although this is a 1-page document, there's a lot here. So you'll notice that, and I've mentioned this before, anything that Texas Realtors or TREC bolds or underlines or capitalizes, it's an important part of the contract. So paragraph A clearly says, the contract is contingent upon buyer's receipt of the proceeds, not a contract on the other house, not an option, but the actual receiving of the money as a result of selling that other property. Okay, so receipt of the proceeds from the sale of buyer's property at, and this is where you would put the address. And then it says, on or before a certain date. So this is what's known as the contingency. So this act has to happen before the deal is consummated and closes. Because then it goes on to say, if the contingency isn't satisfied, which means if that house doesn't sell by the date that you put in here, or the buyer says, you know what, I no longer need this as criteria to buy this other home, so I'm going to waive it. So unless those 2 things happen, the contract will terminate automatically, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So the easy part is the address of that other property. The not so easy part is, when does that have to actually sell? What makes it harder is if that property that has to be sold is not even listed yet or doesn't have a contract on it yet. Okay, so if you represent a buyer, just know, and this is a very common thing, so don't get scared away by a buyer saying, I can only go buy this home that you're showing me if I sell this other one. That's an extremely common occurrence. But your offer to that seller becomes a lot stronger if there's an offer already on that home, let alone it listed. So the problem with house hunting is that if you take a buyer out to go see a home, they're going to fall in love with some home that you show them. And so they're going to want to go charging ahead and buy that home. Well, the challenge is if they have another home that they need to sell, and that home isn't even under contract yet, or it's not even listed yet, unless the seller is desperate or in some kind of distressed situation, they're probably not going to accept that offer. Okay, so that's part one of my kind of speech on paragraph A. My second part is, let's say that your buyer does have a contract. Well, although it's not required to present all that other documentation to the seller, they're probably going to ask you, well, is that offer contingent on selling? Because the person that steps forward and buys this home that they have to sell, well, there's a chance that then they have a contingent offer. You know, they need to sell their home to go buy this one. Then that person needs to get the funds to go buy this one. And so it could become this domino effect that, you know, just bubbles up different questions. Now, let's say that that's not the case. Your buyer, whose home has to sell to go buy this one, has a contract, and you're past the option period, and the drop dead date is they're going to close on October 11th. Well, if you think it's a good idea to make the closing date also on this home you're about to go buy also October 11th, that's probably not a wise decision. Because remember, it says you have to receive the proceeds. So October 11th is a Friday of this year, right? That's tomorrow. And if that closing is any time past noon, then the chances of it closing and funding and then that money getting to this person in time is slim. It's slim even if it closes at 8 a.m. So my point is that it's okay to put October 11th in here, but the closing date on the 1 to 4 for this home they have to go buy should at the very earliest be Monday. And I'm even suggesting maybe Tuesday of that next week, because anything can happen, specifically with the money getting to your buyer in enough time. So don't make this date here and the closing date on the 1 to 4, their other property, the same date. Now, then it goes on to say in paragraph B, if the seller accepts, they should have put another written offer. That's the language they should have used. But if the seller accepts a written offer to sell the property, and what they mean is from somebody else, the seller shall notify the buyer of that acceptance and that the seller requires buyer to waive the contingency. Buyer must waive the contingency on or before, and then you put X amount of days after the seller's notice to the buyer. So let's just kind of unpack that for a second, because it's a little bit misleading. The seller is not going to execute another contract, although this implies that they would, because they use the word accept. Accept to me means they've accepted legally another offer. That's not what this means. It means that another buyer has come forward their realtor has presented an offer to the seller that's already under a contract with your buyer that has to go sell another property that is more favorable. And it might be more favorable because they're paying more, it's a cash offer, and maybe there's no contingency. But whatever reason, the seller decides, I want to go after this offer. And so they then have to give written notice to you and your buyer that that's happened. And then they're going to give your buyer a certain amount of days to decide, do you really need this money to close, or can you waive the contingency? And in my opinion, it's anywhere between 1 or 2 days. So if you were the buyer submitting this, I would put 1 day, because that's going to increase the strength of your offer. A buyer is going to know right away whether or not they can waive the contingency, right? And if they do, then the earnest money is refunded to the buyer. So this is what's known as a kick-out clause. So I've looked in all of the MLSs and all of the cities that we're in, and the only MLS that uses that same naming convention, kick-out, is Dallas-Fort Worth. So if you're in Houston, Austin, San Antonio, or El Paso, or Longview, or Tyler, it's only whether or not a contract is actually contingent. So remember that this is a Texas statewide document. So, but the only MLS that uses the same language as kick-out is Dallas-Fort Worth. So then it goes on to say in paragraph C, buyer may waive the contingency only by notifying the seller of the waiver and depositing an extra amount of money as earnest money. Okay. So then it says if buyer waives the contingency, which means they say, you know what, I really don't need to sell this other home. And that can happen. The only reason that would happen is if they could pay cash for this home, or they could scrape up the money to get a loan, but they didn't want to have 2 mortgages. They could do it, but they didn't want to do it. More often than not, the buyer absolutely needs that money as a result of the sale of another home to go buy this home. That's usually what happens. But then it goes on to say in paragraph D, if buyer waives the contingency and fails to close, and funds solely due to buyer's non-receipt of proceeds from the buyer's sale of the property described in paragraph A, buyer will be in default. So that's a problem. So it's a problem because the buyer usually really wants that home, right? Why else would they enter into this contract? So if the buyer waives that contingency, but they know that in the back of their mind, I just hope that this works out because I really do, A, want the home, but B, I'm not going to be able to do this if I don't sell this home. And I don't want to lose it to this other person. So I'm just going to waive this. Well, that's extremely dangerous. And it creates a delicate situation for you because it's none of your business. You can ask, but that's really between them and the lender. So if you represent the buyer, all you can do is say, if they approach you about waiving the contingency, just pump the brakes a little bit and say, are you sure? Have you talked to your lender? If you waive the contingency and your home doesn't sell and you really do need the money to buy this home, then you're going to be in default. Do you understand what that means? Okay. So that's pretty much the contingency addendum. I am going to review next if you represent a seller and you have to give this piece of paper that says, hey, I've received another offer, and that's what this looks like. But before I move on, does anybody have any questions or have any confusion about this document? Okay, so here's another trick. I mentioned that the only city in the state that uses the word kick out is Dallas. I'm mentioning that because if you have a buyer and they are either in a time crunch and they need to go find a home fast, or there's inventory shortage and there's not many choices out there, then I would include in your search for homes that are potential for your buyer, homes that have a contingency. Now in DFW, it's easy because it already says either active, active option, active pending, and there is a status for active option kickout. I would include that. In any other city that we're in Texas, you're going to want to choose the box that says contingency, yes or no. And I would include yes, because if your buyer is a cash buyer, or if they're putting more than 10% down, or they don't need to go sell a home to go buy this one, I would include those homes, because you never know what situation that seller is going to be in. Right? They might welcome your buyer's offer. So don't be afraid to include those in your search. So the form that a seller would formally present to you and your buyer is this. Okay, you put down the seller's name, the buyer's name, and this would be given to you by the listing agent. And paragraph A says, seller's notice to buyer to remove contingency. Seller has accepted another written offer to purchase the property. Buyer may waive the contingency by notifying the seller in writing of the waiver and depositing any additional required earnest money with escrow agent within the time required under the addendum that we just went over. Then it says if buyer does not waive the contingency and deposit the additional earnest money within the time prescribed, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So if you were on the listing side and an offer came in that included this, I would want this day here in paragraph B to be 1, not any more than that, because the home's already been off the market. And if the seller accepts another offer or wants to execute a contract on a better offer, I wouldn't want to be giving these guys more than 24 hours to decide, right? So I'm trying to wear both hats here, but you can see that this is an extremely simple document. And this is nothing more than the purposes of the seller notifying you and the buyer that I've got another offer here, guys. Let's decide what you want to do. All right. So this is the instrument that you would deploy for presenting that in writing. Man, that title is long too. Notices regarding contingency under addendum for sale of other property. Now you notice that it's a notice, so the top portion does not have to be signed by the buyer because the seller is the one giving the notice, and a notice typically does not have to be countersigned. However, much like the lead-based paint addendum, the seller says, hey, I want to take another offer. Here's my notice to you, Mr. Buyer. Here's my signature. But the buyer has to respond. And this is when the buyer responds and signs it. And the options are buyer waives the contingency and deposits the additional earnest money, or buyer does not waive the contingency and the contract is terminated and the earnest money is refunded. So this is the single document that both parties determine what's going to happen once a new offer comes forward. Okay. Any questions? Again, this is very common. People usually that are in a house need the sale of that house to go buy another one. All right, the next one is addendum for authorization of a hydrostatic testing. Okay, what is a hydrostatic test? Well, typically, this is plumbing related, and it's usually done if the home is really old and there are old pipes, cast iron pipes, or there was known foundation work done, or as a part of the inspection process and the repair amendment, the seller agrees to fix foundation work, and plumbing can get jacked up. Okay, so this is also not uncommon, but you're talking about all the piping going to and from the house, and so there's risk there. So a hydrostatic test ensures that there are no leaks in the plumbing. So again, as I mentioned earlier, anything in these contracts that's underlined, bold, or capitalized is typically a big deal. And so it says, consult a licensed plumber about the scope of hydrostatic testing and risks associated with the testing before signing the form. So just beware. This is not like a sewer camera inspection. Like if you hire an inspector to go do an inspection of a home that was built in 1945, there are some things that they just can't do. And so if it gets to a point where they have to do a hydrostatic test, you need permission for that. Okay, so in paragraph A, it says authorization, seller authorizes buyer at buyer's expense to engage a licensed plumber to perform a hydrostatic plumbing test on the property. Okay, so it clearly says that the seller allows it, but the buyer's paying for it. And then it goes on to say, okay, well, what are my risks here? Okay, B1 says seller shall be liable for damages caused by the hydrostatic plumbing test. And that's usually never checked, but you never know. A seller might, be in a distressed situation. They're like, yeah, I don't anticipate any problems. I'll assume all liability. So you never know. Second option, buyer shall be liable for damages. And then the third option is buyer shall be liable for damages caused by the hydrostatic plumbing test in an amount not to exceed X. Okay, so it's just a test. It is actually pretty low risk, but whenever you're messing with plumbing and pipes, there's risk. So now, mind you, they're using the word damages pretty liberally because there's water going in and out of these pipes as a result of this test. So damages like what? Pipe then bursts and floods the entire house, or the outside portion of it bursts and now there's water bubbling up, but okay, well, whatever, I just get a plumber out there to cut the pipe, rejoin the two, and be on our way. I mean, anything could happen, right? So it's important to kind of nail this down between the buyer, the seller, and the plumbing company doing the test. Okay, but I guess the main point here is that when this is typically done. So whenever there's foundation work done, if you're a buyer or represent the buyer and there was foundation work done, if they can't prove that this was done, I'd push back, because depending on how extensive the foundation work was, pipes are going to get moved. And a copper pipe resting on a pinhead-sized pebble that's now been doing that for 30 years, there can be some damage going on if they start putting piers in. So this is typically already a part of foundation repair anyway. So if a seller doesn't do this, they're trying to cut corners. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. Inspector information. I get this actually frequently. And the last time someone asked me, so I had to hunt around for this. I knew it existed, but I couldn't remember what it was called. Well, funny enough, unlike the other forms, it's simply called inspector information. So this is TXR form 2506. And it basically says that Attached is this is for your buyer. Attached is a list of inspectors licensed by TREC and may also include other persons authorized by law to perform certain inspections. This list is not complete. You may also obtain a list from other sources. This firm, meaning us, strongly recommends that you hire an inspector to help you evaluate the condition of the property. Well, then it goes down here and it says, but we do not recommend any particular inspector and does not warrant the quality of any inspector's inspection. All right. So why does this form exist? Well, because if you scroll down here, it proves that you recommended that they get an inspection, because then they have to check, I choose to hire an inspector or I choose not to hire an inspector. So this was pretty prevalent, a year ago and then prior to that for about 18 months when people just felt that they were forced to buy a home sight unseen, or at the very least just didn't bother to do an inspection. And then so that creates risk because stuff goes wrong and people move in and a month later stuff breaks. And why didn't you tell me this? Well, I recommended that you got an inspection. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. Don't you remember that conversation we had out at the curb as you were, pressuring me to write an offer in the next 10? No, that never happened. Well, as sure as you're standing there, you know that it did, but this proves that it actually happened. Right? So this is a good one to include in your templates for buyers, just to cover your base. The thing I love about Texas is that if there's a situation, any possible situation, man, someone's made a form for it. And as simple as this conversation may seem to go all the time, 99.9% of the time is that 0.1% that can create risk. So that's why this exists. Any questions or input on this one?
Brad, I have a quick question.
Yep.
Are you required to accompany a list of inspectors, or can you just present this to them without a list saying, select your own inspector, or is it required to accompany a list?
The good question. The way it reads here is that this implies that you're including a list of people. Now, mind you, you can go onto TREC's website and just search for licensing, because TREC governs inspectors. Mm-hmm. So you can filter out inspectors and give it to them. Or if you have a local list of inspectors, just make sure that they have a license with TREC. They would, of course, but you can do that. Or you can just, cross that part out. Yeah, if you don't have a list, I wouldn't feel obligated.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
I tell my buyers that unless they have a family member that is a licensed contractor, I require my buyers to get an inspection because I think that is just liability for us.
Oh, 100%.
I think it's good for everybody.
I couldn't agree more.
It's a small amount of the purchase price.
Say that again?
It's a small amount of their purchase price.
Oh, yeah. And it's a small amount to lose if the deal doesn't go through. And it just creates headache for the seller because, stuff pops up that is a deal breaker, but the seller then has to go on and redisclose what popped up. And which is my other point, which is I don't know why, to your point, Valerie, $400 is such a big deal, because I've seen a lot of buyers say, well, there was an inspection done on this, last year, I'll just go with that report. And that's crazy too. So, but yeah, in this, as we migrate out of this market where you just felt like you had to buy stuff sight unseen, I don't know why anybody would not get an inspection. Okay. This next one can be a little bit confusing, but it does come up, and I think it should be used more, actually. especially if you're the listing agent. So if you're the listing agent, you may be familiar with this, but if you're a buyer's agent, this is probably an addendum that you've not seen a whole lot. And this is simply entitled Seller's Invitation to Buyer to Submit New Offer. That just sounds so civilized, doesn't it? Sellers, I'm inviting you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, to submit a new offer, if you would. And that is TXR 1926. And so there's a lot of free-form text here that you can write. Basically, a seller would present this to you and the buyer if the offer that you submitted was either way off, or more commonly, if the seller has certain criteria that wouldn't have been known before, that offer that you're getting is just so close that you want to counter back and say, if you just change this, this, and this, the seller's going to accept your offer. Now, you can't say that because agents think that that's a binding agreement, and it's not, and so it just creates more confusion. But it basically says in paragraph 1, seller does not accept the offer, the above referenced offer you submitted. Then it goes on to say, you are invited to submit another offer, which seller may more favorably consider if. So maybe the option period was 10 days and you want it to be 5. You would put that there. You can put price in there. Nowadays, you can now put compensation in there. Seller credit or buyer credit. You could put who pays for the title policy. Maybe the loan type you submitted was FHA and they didn't want to do that because the home is 70 years old and it's not going to pass. And so maybe this would say, go get another loan type. Right? Some people do FHA because the down payment's not as much, but they could do conventional. And so, say that. And so then it goes on to say, this communication and invitation is not a counteroffer. Okay, the property remains on the market. Seller may consider other offers and accept another offer. Okay, so this is just the written version of the usual verbal that goes back and forth about the offer and the counteroffer. But if a seller's agent has a hot property, they may be getting offers consistently. So they may not want to counter verbally every single offer because they're drinking from a fire hose. So it's a lot easier to keep everything straight if you do it this way. And how many times have either we as buyer's agents, or if you represent the seller, have been asked by the buyer's agent, even before an offer is submitted, well, just tell me what the seller wants. Can you tell me what would make this offer attractive? What is the seller looking for? And of course, the agent can't tell you anything. So this is, the seller's way of saying, oh, you're so close. You're so close. Just change this, 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 and time is of the essence, though, because as that last line says, this is not binding. This just is an indication of what the seller is willing to do. So do this and do it quickly, and it's implied that your offer is going to get accepted. Okay, so does that make sense? So this is, sometimes buyer's agents have never seen this before and are very confused by it. So that's kind of what all that means. Okay. Okay. Another biggie, and equally as important because it's binding and it can get your buyer into a lot of trouble if you don't do this, is a notice of withdrawal. Now, this does have the word notice in it. It does have a signature for the seller, but I'm telling you that it just has to be signed by the buyer. So when would you do this? Well, are all realtors really responsive to offers that you send in? When you represent a buyer and you send in an offer, aren't you expecting some kind of response or at least an acknowledgement within the day? And so sometimes that doesn't happen. And I get call after call after call wondering what to do, what does it mean? And so if you refer back to your learnings from real estate school, what it means is that you don't have a silence can be an interpretation of an offer refusal, or at the very least, an indication that they don't value your buyer's time and they're dragging their feet. Now, it also might mean that they've gotten multiple offers in, or they've gotten word that another offer is coming in and they want to kind of keep you at arm's length before they formally reach out to you. So all these things should sound familiar, right? They've happened to all of us at one point or another. Well, in my coaching, I always say, you're going to have a heart-to-heart with your buyer and decide whether or not they want to continue wasting time. Because a home that meets their same criteria is just like a city bus. There's one right around the corner if this one doesn't work out, and they have to embrace that reality. The second, more incredibly risky reason is because if that seller doesn't reach out to you and even acknowledge that they've received the offer, and you're waiting and you're waiting, and all of a sudden 2 full days go by and the buyer says, forget it. They must not want my offer. Let's go look at another offer. And then all of a sudden on day 3, you get an executed contract. You're in trouble. It's not good business practice, but it is legal because your buyer was the first one to sign it. So there is nothing else to do for your buyer. All you're waiting on is the seller to sign it. I think it's pretty crappy that they would drag their feet and all of a sudden lock you into something legally binding that requires delivery of earnest money and option fee in order for your buyer to get out. But it can be done, and it is done. So in an effort to prevent that from happening and putting your buyer at risk, this is the form that you would use. Notice of withdrawal of offer, which is TXR form 1945. All right, for you history buffs, 1945 is a momentous year in this country's history, as is December 7th, but that's a conversation for another day. So, this is when you would send in this document if you're not getting anywhere with the seller, or if there's enough time that goes by between you sending in an offer, but your buyer is still looking at homes and they, oh my gosh, a day later, they found something they like better, or they lost their job, or the lender goes back and says, you know what? I made a mistake. You really don't qualify for a $400,000 home. It's more like $350,000. And your buyer has to get out quickly. So this is the legal instrument that you use to get out. Okay. And typically you're checking box B. Okay. Buyer withdrawals, all previously submitted offers and counter offers to purchase or sell the above referenced property. Okay. This is a biggie. Any questions on that one? Okay. Very popular in Texas, especially rural areas, sometimes not rural areas, to have an on-site sewer facility. That is a fancy word for a septic system. So a home, especially if it's a mobile home, is either getting their sewer facilities by either the town that they're in, or they have a septic system that is buried in the ground. And they're supposed to be disclosing this in the listing and in the seller's disclosure. If your buyer wants to go buy a home and the seller's disclosure says, I don't know, when it comes to this, I would be very wary, because sometimes they're hard to spot. So it's basically this kind of submarine looking apparatus. It's long and it has 2 or 3 manhole cover size looking, they look like manhole covers, that sometimes are visible, but sometimes there's grass that's grown over it. And boy, if that's the case, I would really be aware, because that means it hasn't been serviced in a long time. But you got to know about this because they are governed by TCEQ. I can't remember what that stands for, but it's the people that govern in Texas sewage systems and septic systems. All right, so this is presented by, this should be uploaded in the MLS, because only the seller would know this stuff. So this is just a notice given to the buyer on behalf of the seller with regards to what they know about the septic system. Now, if for some reason they do check unknown on all these, and maybe it's unknown on the seller's disclosure, yes, I would be concerned, but that's not all that uncommon. You will need a separate, specially licensed inspector to inspect the sewer system. Just because you're an inspector doesn't mean you have the licensure to inspect a septic system. There's added education and licensing that goes with this. Okay. Now, if they only fill partially out, hopefully they have records on the maintenance of that system. Okay. A good homeowner is going to have this. Now, septic systems are pretty low maintenance, unless there is a family of 5 or 6 people living in there and they treat it like a regular sewer system, and they throw all sorts of stuff down there that shouldn't be down there. It gets clogged, whatever. But low maintenance meaning it's just a tank that collects the household's waste, and the water part of it gets disposed of regularly in various ways, depending on what kind of system you have. But the solids have to get pumped out every like 3 to 5 years. So it's not a, it's not like cleaning your gutters every year, right? So, but that being said, if the homeowner has neglected that, that could be an issue. So if that homeowner's lived in that home more than 5 years, I'd want to see these records. And if they don't have them, that means they haven't exercised proper maintenance. Okay, but this is given to you, the buyer's agent, by the seller. Any questions on that one? Okay, and then this is a new one. Addendum containing notice of obligation to pay improvement district assessment to, and then whatever municipality that gets paid to. So,
Hey, Brad,
yeah,
I'm sorry. Is there a place in the county where that information regarding any service or anything that has been done on the septic?
there's not. And it's interesting you should ask that, because many of you know I just got my broker's license in New Mexico, and New Mexico's law requires what you're just suggesting. You can't buy a home if it has a septic system without a brand new inspection. But there is not such a requirement in Texas.
There is California as well. And on the counties, if have these inspections, and typically when you pull up the property profile, it tells you there's a septic and the last time it was done. So I'm surprised that Texas doesn't have that.
I am too, and I'm all for those laws. I'm going to tell you why. Because if they had those laws, then you wouldn't run into what I hear all the time, which is you represent the buyer. They go look at a home that has a septic system. Oh, yeah, I've had a septic system in other homes. That's no big deal. And then they get it serviced and or inspected, and it's so old it has to be torn out, or it's not functioning as it should be and it has to be torn out, or it wasn't installed properly and it has to be torn out. So you can actually install your own septic system. It's not, recommended, but you can. But the TCEQ has to inspect it. It's kind of like getting permit work done, but you don't ever go get the permit. So there's no check and balance system. So, I mean, it's such a vital part of your home. As a buyer's agent, if you're showing people these homes, you got to ask a lot of questions about that stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. So a public improvement district can have big implications for a mortgage payment or your monthly payment, right? And so, as I mentioned before, this is yet another contract that has a bunch of stuff capitalized right in the middle of the document, and it says an assessment has been levied. So an assessment implies that there's an end to it, and there is. A PID, I'll explain what that is in a second, but the PID assessment is a 30-year commitment, and it goes with the home. And unfortunately, these things are brand new, pretty much. So you're not going to find one that's older than probably 10 or 15 years. But anyway, an assessment has been levied against your property for the authorized improvements. And improvements are going to be roadways, infrastructure, sewer systems, electricity, water. Okay, just kind of park that for a second, which may be paid in full at any time if the assessment is not paid in full. It will be due and payable in annual installments that will vary from year to year, depending on the amount of interest paid, collection costs, administrative costs, and delinquency costs. All right, so this is public knowledge, and the lender / title company, the lender, is responsible for what that dollar assessment is. Now, in the MLS and in the seller's disclosure, it asks you, is this thing in a PID? And so if it is, then just explain to your client that there's going to be an extra amount of money tacked onto your monthly payment. And I don't quote me, but I don't think it changes. I don't think it's like taxes and insurance. I just think it's an assessment that was figured out before the developer laid the first brick and said, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Mayor of town XYZ, I want to build a 1,500 single family home development here, and I need your help. Well, what with? Well, we need to put roads in, we need to put right of ways, we need to put signage, we need to get sewer out here, water. Okay, well, the town's willing to give you this, but you're going to pass that cost that we're going to incur onto the owners of those homes. Everybody tracking with me on that? So that's what that is. And that extra amount is paid with your escrow to, whoever services your loan. Okay. So this is a notice from the seller to the buyer. But this is a big question to ask up front, just as it is, are you in a MUD, which is a municipal utility district, which is a entity that provides water, among other things, to a development. But this is more than that. Okay, now the good news is in 30 years it gets paid off. That money, that assessment goes away, but there aren't many people that are living in their homes for the full 30 years. So that client needs to expect to pay that every month until they sell it.
Hey, Brad,
Go ahead.
do you know of any areas that have these? I haven't encountered one yet.
Yeah, they're going to be in developing towns. Like, so for you, Victor, think of towns like Anna and Melissa and Aubrey, anywhere outside the normal city center where they're developing new homes, anywhere where there's land.
Okay, no wonder. I don't go around those places.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the lender is legally bound to give your clients a loan estimate, which can't really change. So it is incumbent upon them to include that cost in there. They can't just come by, 3 weeks into the contract and say, oh yeah, by the way, there's a PID assessment and your payment's going to change. So usually it's the lender's responsibility. All right, and that's it. I didn't think I was going to get through those 8 in all that time. So those are the ones that I wanted to go over. They come up just so infrequently enough that we no sooner learn about how to use them than we forget them, because we just don't use them a lot. But they are very important. All right, so anything else for today? That was all I had.
Brett, the only thing I would have is the inspections. I usually make the people get the form for your inspection, for your protection, get a home inspection.
Yeah.
But when I give them the numbers of the inspectors, I don't make them sign that form. I give them 3, 4 different numbers, and I let them decide who they're going to choose, and then they go to the house and do the inspection. And I try to not get into the inspection myself because I don't want to get involved. And that's just the way I've been doing it. But
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. I think that works. I think that document is just an added insurance policy for people that don't want to go get an inspection. So it's not required, but if there's any hesitation with your client on getting an inspection, just to prove that you recommended it, I would get that document signed.
But with the signature of the form that we make them sign for your protection, get a home inspection, isn't that enough?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, the one that I went over today came about from the really busy market we had a year or so ago when people just weren't doing them. It's because if they wasted time in doing an inspection, they would have lost the home. So it was more done for that instance.
I see. Thank you.
Yep. All right, awesome. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate your time. Hopefully you got something out of that contracts tutorial, and we'll see you back here next week, same time. We're going to do some CE with Super Inspector, and it should be a real good class. So I'll send out the information on that. So awesome. Well, you know where to find me if you need me, and you guys have a great rest of the week. Take care, y'all.
Thank you, Brad.